Good day and welcome to our first session in the Think Big Virtual Forum. My name is Peter Henderson from Reuters News, and I'm your moderator. Think Big focuses on the topic of a cleaner, greener recovery from COVID-19. The 6 sessions will explore how impact assessment can contribute to a more sustainable future by incorporating climate change and ecocentric perspectives into our economic recovery. It's co-hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment and the Earth Law Center. Today's session will be on the theme, "The World Has Pivoted Because of COVID-19, Should Impact Assessment as Well?" Our first speaker is Peter Kroll. He's a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society with a geology degree from Carleton University. Peter's been working in the field of environmental assessment and international development for over 35 years. He focuses on the relationship between environmental management, resource extraction, and poverty reduction in developing countries and the Arctic. Peter will discuss how to respond to a growing global movement to weaken impact assessment policy.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Kroll. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada, and I'm really happy to be with you today. I've been working on impact assessment probably for over 35 years. I'm a retired geologist, and I've been with IAIA as a member for probably 30 years. I've been involved in many committees and subjects there. And I look forward to talking to you today about the effect of COVID on impact assessment and where we need to take our practice going forward. So the title is, COVID has changed the world. Should impact assessment pivot as well? And I would like to make a quote at this point that is kind of like overarching everything I'm saying. And the quote is this: "What does it eat in winter?" So just hang on to that for a second, because I'll be getting to that later on in my talk. So no one or institution has been untouched by COVID over the last couple of years. All institutions and governments and people have had to do this thing called pivoting. And what about impact assessment? After 50 years of impact assessment practice, we have climate change emergencies, biodiversity loss, and many tipping points being breached around the world. In 2020, IAIA did a membership survey. There were 3 of them. Some of you might have participated in them, to see how COVID changed impact assessment. And the results are quite sobering. Over 30% of impact assessment laws and practices around the world were either suspended or relaxed. Typically, the most common things that changed during this suspension or relaxation of impact assessment was public participation, and timelines were changed quite a bit. So the key questions I ask is, will this be the norm for impact assessment post-COVID? And will regulators restrict impact assessment to pay for the COVID-induced deficits that every government is now facing? Basically, can impact assessment be further maybe marginalized to fast-track extractive infrastructure projects? So for us to think about is, how does impact assessment get in front of these rollback conversations? As I said earlier, we've had impact assessment for 50 years, and yet we continue to hear that it's still bureaucratic, protracted, and complicated after 50 years of practice. Now, I came across this description of impact assessment the other day from a scientific journal, and here's the quote from the author: "The path to disastrous climate change is paved with feasibility studies and impact assessments." And that's from a scientific journal, 2021. So here's where I get to this quote I made at the beginning of my talk, saying, what does it eat in winter? Back in the 80s, I was working for the Canadian International Development Agency, and we hired a consultant through the OECD to go around the world to interview all presidents and deputy ministers of the development aid agencies that were working with the OECD. And the purpose of those interviews was to ask them about their views about impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment. And when the Interviewer interviewed my own deputy minister, who at that time was the president of the Canadian International Development Agency. She turned to the interviewer, who was Gordon Beanlands, who was a researcher at that time at Dalhousie University, and said, "What does it eat in winter?" And that has stuck with me for over 30 years. Basically, what she was saying is, in a crisis, what stays and what goes? So we're in a crisis. We're still in a crisis. COVID has changed impact assessment over the last couple of years. And what is going to happen after COVID to impact assessment? Is impact assessment robust enough to respond? And are regulators convinced impact assessment is beneficial for the environment, social, and financial storm we are all in right now? So let's look at Canada and see what happened here. This is my home country. Victoria Gooday did a report in March 2021 called Environmental Regulation and the COVID-19 Pandemic, a review of regulator response in Canada. And again, the findings are quite alarming. All provinces and territories in Canada, except just two, except Manitoba and Northwest Territories, made changes to impact assessment during the COVID time. And these changes included suspension of operational requirements, limiting monitoring, extension of reporting activity. There was payment relief, license extensions to proponents. There was limiting government requests, limited reporting, and reduced or eliminated public participation. Now, here's the conclusion of that study, is that there was over 100 changes made to regulations in Canada because of COVID, including impact assessment, and 1/3 of these are expected to be indefinite. In Ontario, the Environmental Assessment Act was changed virtually with no public comment. Some say this contravenes the Ontario Bill of Rights. The project list was changed, and for example, sewage treatment plants are no longer on the project list in Ontario. And the decisions to support the changes to the Environmental Assessment Act in Ontario were not based on scientific or technical data. And another example of what's happening in Ontario, we've got one of the largest chromium deposits that's going to be mined over the next 50 years in Northern Ontario. It's called the Ring of Fire, and there's the potential for 17 new mines in Northern Ontario. It's a greenfield development. This is a virgin boreal forest, and the Ontario government does not want to have a strategic environmental assessment. So COVID is really a perfect storm for impact assessment. And it's ironic, isn't it, that at a time when environment and climate change issues are accelerating, impact assessment is being relaxed. Swiss Re, one of the largest reinsurers in the world, reported about 4 months ago in one of their studies that 1/4 of all countries are at risk of collapse because of ecosystem declines. We ignore this at our peril. And we know that impact assessment can be part of the solution to some of these ecosystem problems. Paul Romer, in 2008, one of the economists who was studying the 2008 financial collapse, said, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." We are in a crisis right now, I believe, with impact assessment, and we have some opportunities to turn this around. Should impact assessment pivot because of COVID? I say yes, and I hope you will consider this as a topic for further conversation. I think we need to make more alliances with insurance companies and corporations who are investing in the private sector to show how impact assessment manages risk. Risk management is at the center for banks and insurance companies today. We just have to look at the ESG and the finance sector relationships to see how that's growing and deepening. But impact assessment is extremely vulnerable now because of the restrictions and suspension of impact assessment practices around the world. We must shape our forward-looking agenda before it is shaped for us. We cannot afford being the recipient of other people's agendas post-COVID. In 2018, Nature Canada asked over 160 environmental leaders in Canada what their core message was. And of those 160 environmental leaders in Canada, there was not one that had the same message about what their brand was. So if we had someone ask impact assessment, what is our core message? What could we say? What is our elevator pitch today? If a regulator or a president of a corporation is asking us, what's the key benefit of impact assessment? Is it the same message we've been giving for the last 50 years? Because I don't think it's going to resonate. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and now advising the UN, says, with better information as a foundation, we can build a virtuous cycle of better understanding of tomorrow's risks, better pricing for investors, and better decisions by policymakers, and a smoother transition to a lower carbon economy. Is that not at the heart of what impact assessment does? And that was said by a banker and an economist. Here's what I think IAIA needs to do over the next short term. We need to have, as a minimum, all impact assessments reviewed by third parties. We need to avoid the conflict of interest that is embedded by consultants doing impact assessments for their clients. We have to make sure that impact assessments are done after a strategic environmental assessment. And can we tell a story? We are a very caring and deeply embedded population of people who care very much about the planet and the people that live on it. And can we tell the story through impact assessment? Are we communicating clearly enough about what we're trying to do? We also need to say no as practitioners to carbon heavy projects. Just say no, we're not taking on that assignment. And we have to avoid this practice of continually giving huge, massive reports. As one client said, this has to stop. We just can't deal with these massive bricks anymore. So in conclusion, we have to make impact assessment wider. The constituency for impact assessment has to be much wider, not just the client and regulator. It has to be relevant to risk managers, institutional investors, as well as communities. We are talking about next generation impact assessment, and many researchers have written about this in the past. My 3 takeaway points for the next generation impact assessment is challenge. Challenge the status quo of impact assessment. Second point, nudge. Nudge to more sustainable decisions as we write our impact assessments. And the third point is motivate. Motivate for a wider constituency. I conclude with a quote from the Hopi tribe, the United States. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Does IAIA need to pivot? Yes, it does. And I hope we can start the conversation now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for a great start. Our second and final speaker for this session is Dr. Alan Bond. Alan is a professor at the School of Environmental Science at the University of East Anglia in the UK. He's also an extraordinary professor for the Research Unit for Environmental Sciences and Management at Northwest University. Using examples from around the world, Alan will look at the threats and opportunities that COVID-19 presents to impact assessments and what we can do about them.
Hi, so I'm Alan Bond from the University of East Anglia and Northwest University of South Africa. And on behalf of a number of colleagues who are all listed in this slide, I'm going to talk about the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on impact assessment itself around the world. Inevitably, I'm going to start off with some evidence that IAIA itself has collected. So here we see some survey information based on the second and third surveys that IAIA undertook of its members. And I think the first thing to say there is that it's been a really useful survey, and it's given us an idea that COVID-19 has been putting pressure on impact assessment processes. But I think it's also worthwhile being clear that it's been a perception study, and it's impossible to identify a link between the perceptions and actual countries, and also that perceptions vary. And if we just look at some of the evidence that's been coming through, we'll see that members perceive that government has taken no action in roughly half or just over half of all cases. But in other cases, we'll see that there's a perception that there's pressure, and there's pressure either to bypass impact assessment rules, formally or informally, but also potentially to change impact assessment rules. So the purpose of this particular presentation is to try and examine actual evidence that impact assessment is under threat in specific locations. So between the different authors, we have access to information in our own countries and some other selected countries where we can take a bit more of a detailed look at exactly what's happened. And here I should say there's a disclaimer. At the point in time when we gather information, it's just that, it's a snapshot in time. And it's very clear that it's rapidly changing. So please don't take away any of the evidence from this presentation and assume that it's still valid. Even 1 week in the future, you would really need to check. But what I think this presentation will show is that there is some evidence that impact assessment has been affected by the pandemic. And when we get to the end and I conclude, I think it'll be safe to conclude that it's up to us to decide in which direction that change to impact assessment takes place. So moving on, we can start by looking at India. And there's been some evidence coming through from India in particular that impact assessment has been threatened. And you'll see here there's a quote taken from this website here, where a revision to the environmental impact assessment notification was proposed. So a draft notification came out in 2020, which was during the pandemic, after the start of the pandemic. And what this did was try and facilitate easier development by basically reducing some of the requirements of the impact assessment legislation in India. So you'll see that environmentalists and researchers were concerned that the draft legislation legitimized violations by people who wanted to bypass some of the steps required in impact assessment. So evidence like this shows us that there is pressure, and that pressure goes as far as changing the text of forthcoming legislation to try and facilitate development by reducing the implications, or rather the requirements for environmental impact assessment. So it's a very simplistic: time and resources used in environmental impact assessment is something we could do without when we want to build. Now, it was a draft, so I'm not entirely sure how that has come to pass. So this is the kind of thing that we need to keep an eye on. And you'll see that some of the press were reporting that the draft notification was very clearly an attempt to weaken regulations. So we also have some evidence from the United States about impact assessment being under threat, but this is an example of this being nothing to do, I don't think, with COVID. So the Council on Environmental Quality produced regulations which implement the National Environmental Policy Act, which was the world's first EIA legislation. And they were first adopted in 1978, but were changed for the first time on September the 14th, 2020. And there's been a bit of debate about whether those changes are a good thing or a bad thing. And critics pretty much argue that some of the changes are disadvantageous for certain groups and communities of colour, for example. And there's a shortened review process. But then other observers argue that the regulations were really out of date. were quite time consuming and needed updating. So there are different views there, and I think it's worth being clear here that there are changes which might be coincident with the pandemic, which had clearly already started before the pandemic. And it's not always clear that the pandemic has changed these regulations in any way. And I think the United States is one example where that's happened. Canada is a really good example of somewhere where there has been exploration of specific pressures stemming from COVID itself. And a report has been produced. So a little image of the report in the top left corner here. You'll see environmental regulation and the COVID-19 pandemic, a review of regulator response in Canada. And it's divided into all the different territories within Canada and shows you what kind of changes to environmental rules have taken place. So it's broader than impact assessment and doesn't focus specifically on impact assessment, although any impact assessment changes would be included. And apart from Manitoba, you'll see that there's been a lot of changes, and those changes vary considerably in terms of what they actually are, whether it's actually suspending obligations to do certain things, and that might be to undertake monitoring in some cases, or operating activities themselves being suspended. So they're very variable, but it's a really clear picture that what they've undertaken in this research has specifically looked for COVID-19 being the justification for these changes. And they've only included them in this report where they've identified COVID-19 as being the cause. So again, we see it's a pressure. There's definitely pressure to change things. And these pressures have led to changes in environmental rules across all of Canada, apart from Manitoba. So pretty broad ranging. In Australia, we see that there was also pressure to change environmental laws. And in particular, there was a review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And this is the act which introduces environmental impact assessment to the Commonwealth of Australia. So not EIA regulations within any of the particular states or territories, but for Commonwealth activities themselves. And the whole idea was that it was thought by people proposing changes to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act that it was requiring too much time and costing too much money to be implemented properly. So we'll see what we've seen in other jurisdictions as well is reference to green tape and trying to cut down on green tape. So all about the bureaucracy associated with procedures like environmental impact assessment. Now, despite this push, should we say, from various people within the government suggesting that there should be changes, and the proposal was specifically to make changes to the Act requiring environmental impact assessment before any evidence was gathered, but others did push back. So this didn't actually happen, and the current situation, whilst I give this presentation, is that we're in limbo, waiting to see if the government is going to do anything, waiting to see if it's going to take any action and reduce green tape, or wait for some evidence to come in about whether the environmental regulations are actually worth the time and money they take, and push back against these proposals. So again, what we see here in Australia is pressure to make changes, but that pressure is currently being resisted, and we await action to see what's going to happen. Now, the United Kingdom, where I'm based, is a little bit different because you'll all be aware that we're going through this Brexit process. In fact, we've now left the European Union, and that has changed the whole legal context for environmental impact assessment. As a member state of the European Union, the United Kingdom was bound by the obligations of an environmental impact assessment directive. It is no longer bound by that directive. And therefore, the space has been created whereby changes can be made to the EIA regulations. But if we look at some of the rhetoric coming from some of the ministers, like George Eustice, who is the Secretary of State for the Environment, he refers to EIA being clunky, bureaucratic, involving a lot of consultants, taking a lot of time, ticking a lot of boxes, producing a lot of papers. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, also referred to COVID, teaching us the cost of delay, time is money, and newt counting delays, direct reference to the kind of thing that happens in environmental impact assessment, because newts are protected species in our system, are massive. So here we see that the COVID has created an economic driver to reduce this green tape, which we see as a narrative in many countries. But in UK, the legal space has been created whereby changes can be pushed through. So there's been lots of consultation on proposed changes, and we still await the actual changes that are going to appear in draft regulations. There has been pushback from the EIA community and an awful lot of consultation responses, and that's delaying the final text, which will be put before Parliament. So we wait and see. So again, the conclusion is that COVID is being used as an argument to justify proposed changes, but those changes have not yet happened. So COVID is pressure. It provides justification for those who seek to push against the administrative and cost requirements of impact assessment. Also in South Africa, we found that there was some pressure. Now, it wasn't really related to impact assessment specifically, but clearly what we saw was that there was a big reduction in the outputs or production from mines in a number of African countries. And in these African countries, a large proportion of GDP comes from mining activities. So you can see that there's a very clear threat coming from COVID-related lockdowns and COVID-related illnesses, which are directly impacting on the income of countries. And that economic imperative was really clear. So what we saw in South Africa was that new regulations were adopted in April 2020 that suspended the usual environmental regulatory processes. And the new regulations specify that that will be for the duration of any lockdown period. So there is definitely a temporary pushback against environmental regulations, which include things like environmental impact assessment. But that's just one country, but we see that COVID is the pressure that has led to something which is a temporary suspension. So that fits in with some of the perception survey. Some people identified temporary suspensions, some people identified permanent weakening of impact assessment. Some people suggested that impact assessment processes would be strengthened. Now, why would impact assessment become more important as a result of the pandemic? And if we start to look at the causes, it becomes really clear why that will be the case. What we do know is that in the initial host for the coronavirus were bats. What we're unclear on is what the intermediary host might have been. So there's a whole range of hypotheses, but there's no clarity yet over the pathway, whether it came through live animals in wet markets, whether it came through some other routes and some other animals before being transmitted to human beings, where, as we know, it's spread across the world. Now, impact assessment deals with this environmental cause of COVID, or rather the transmission pathways. What happens in the environment surrounding these intermediary hosts and the initial host, and those causal pathways is part of what impact assessment does. So if we want to protect ourselves from future pandemics, then impact assessment is a pretty crucial tool, because we already do some of the predictions that help us to come up with mitigation measures that make future pandemics less likely. So we're in a good position to push against the pressures to weaken impact assessment. So more evidence that impact assessment could become more important. We know the population's growing. As the population grows, we take up more space. Basically, that leads to increases in populations of intermediary hosts for viruses. So, for example, pigs and poultry, which are known intermediary hosts where a virus can jump from, for example, a bat or a rat through an intermediary host, which is in considerable contact with human beings. Socio-cultural factors, which we know we can control through the use of things like wet markets. And then what we would call anthropization, where we bring humans, intermediary species into greater contact. So as we expand into new areas of nature, we do things like use more lighting or bring lighting into natural areas, which attracts insects, which attracts bats, and therefore we're encouraging into our own living area the very hosts that can transmit these coronaviruses. And there's evidence that the known wildlife hosts of the pathogens of concern that lead to things like COVID comprise a greater proportion of species richness and total abundance in sites under substantial human use. So there's plenty of evidence that that's the case. And for bats, there's also a correlation between the IUCN threat status and viral richness. So the more threatened the bat species, the more viral richness there is. So in impact assessment, where we might start to look at the implications on species and habitats, it's a very small step then to make that connection with the potential for future viruses and future pandemics. So again, impact assessment is there to help, and we can make this case quite strongly. So further evidence is this quote from Burley: global risk patterns linking anthropogenic drivers and zoonotic viruses suggest that as human populations continue to expand into pristine and potentially virus-rich habitat, particularly in tropical hotspots, the threat of zoonoses will increase. So these are cases we can make through the application of impact assessment. Do we know which direction impact assessment will go in? From the evidence that we've put together, it can go in different directions. But really, I think it's definitely up to us. And when I say us, I mean us as impact assessment practitioners. What we know and what we can see from the evidence we've looked at is that there are threats from very powerful lobby organizations that use this narrative of impact assessment being green tape. But the lobbyists represent their own interests. They make money from developing, and we need to represent ours. We need to push back and explain just what the economic value is of impact assessment as a tool to prevent future pandemics. Because if there's one cost which is going to outweigh all of the costs, it's the cost that all countries have experienced in fighting the pandemic. And if we can make a case that impact assessment could help mitigate that future cost, then it will be really easy to push back from these powerful lobby organizations. And as an example I've shown here, this is the sort of pressure that we've been experiencing in the UK. We've got a collection of essays on reforming the planning system, and it's written by business leaders. And it's really biased in favor of removing green tape and trying to reduce the need for and cost of things like impact assessment, which they see as a threat to development. And we have to recognize that people have a right to lobby in this way. And I think we have to become a bit more politically active and do our own lobbying and provide the counter arguments. And I believe our counter arguments are stronger. So we're in a very good position, I feel. So finally, as I say, one of the things we can do is make our own evidence and use social media in ways which we previously haven't. So myself and some colleagues have done that. So we've been writing blogs where we've been given pushing back against these stories about green tape. So there's an example following this leak here. And we've also written in The Conversation, where we suggested that environmental regulations might be the first casualties if the lobbyists get their way in a post-pandemic recovery. But I genuinely believe that if we become a little bit more political, we can push back against these arguments. So in conclusion, I would say that COVID-19 has provided an additional arguments for those who already seek to weaken impact assessment. So it's new justification, but for the same people making the same arguments. When we actually look at the evidence, it's actually quite difficult to demonstrate causality between COVID-19 and impact assessment legislative changes. There are some short-term changes in environmental legislation, but there's not really very strong evidence that COVID-19 has specifically changed EIA processes. And also, it's very clear that the pandemic provides very strong arguments for those wishing to strengthen impact assessment. What we don't see are political lobbyists pushing that argument. And I think it's down to us to do that. There's an opportunity to carry out some more detailed research that we would need to identify specific examples of changes to impact assessment legislation, which we might attribute to COVID-19. All I've done is show a snapshot. And there could well be some evidence in many of the other jurisdictions that exist around the world. But the sense we have from having a look at a snapshot like this is that COVID-19 is the pressure being used to justify existing pressure to make changes to impact assessment, but that we can push back against it. So the final bullet point here, it seems far more sensible for us to focus on how impact assessment can prevent or mitigate pandemic threats. So I'm going to leave it there. The final slide are the references that have been cited in some of the slides in case anybody wants to look up a little bit more. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alan, for wrapping up today's session. Today's session is the first part of a 6-part series, with the next session next Thursday, the 4th of November, at the same time as today. Between the sessions, you're encouraged to engage in the online discussion, which you can find at thinkbig.iaia.org. Whether you joined us live or are watching this as a recording, please join the online conversation to provide your thoughts and questions. Thanks for your time today. We look forward to connecting you with the next session, which will cover the theme of COVID-19 impacts on impact assessment. See you then.